guys, welcome to another edition of Down to Business. I'm Andrew Beattie, and today I've got Andrew Windybank from SWS Lawyers joining me. We're talking all things really, I guess, M&A, succession, exit of your business, divestments, that sort of thing. So Andrew's a specialist in that area, but I'll let him tell you a bit more about himself and what he does and works with business owners.
Thanks, Andrew. So I'm an M&A specialist lawyer. I've been doing that for more than 20 years now. And SWS.
M&A's mergers and acquisitions.
That's correct, yeah. And SWS Lawyers is a boutique corporate and commercial law firm. So we've got sort of 7 lawyers that have got 20 or so years experience and then a team under us. And we specialise in 4 things. We do M&A and corporate commercial advisory work. We do a lot of contractual and tender type work, that sort of thing in the commercial space. We do a lot of property work, we do a lot of succession and succession planning work, particularly for families and family groups. And we do a lot of commercial litigation type work. That's the firm. In terms of M&A, we're probably the largest M&A team in the Hunter Valley. We've been working together as a team for nearly 15 years. James Stevenson and myself have been working in practice together for that long. It's primarily what we do. It's the bulk of the firm's sort of business, and it's a focus and an interest of a lot of our lawyers.
Yeah, good. And I think that's the part that, I know when we've had a lot of dealings, it's in that space, and you're right, there's quite a few businesses and transactions been involved with. So I guess when we bring it back, you'd see businesses from, mum and dad businesses or smaller, right up to the big end of town and that sort of thing. But I know when you spoke before, there's still a lot of similarities in what needs to happen with any transaction. So I guess maybe, tell us how you work with business owners to either get them ready or realise their ultimate succession.
Yeah, it depends on the business and it depends on the individuals. I think the first thing that I would say is that you've really got to get on well with your advisors and the team that you put around you. If I can say that sort of 20 years ago when I first started practicing in the space, the way in which roles were defined and the activities of the relevant professionals involved in a merger or an acquisition or a divestment transaction was very well defined. It's blurred now. It's a very different space, I think. Certainly accountants do a lot more than they used to. Merchant bankers in the mid-market space, for example, have a much more significant role quite often. Lawyers have probably taken a back seat relative to what they used to do. All of that mix is a good thing, I think, because the individuals involved, the sellers, the owners of the business, need to get the best of the relevant professionals they're working with. So I think it depends on the people, it depends on the type of business, but it's all about the team that you put around you.
Okay, so a fair bit of collaboration.
Yeah, I think collaboration is the key. And it's very important early on in a transaction to define those roles. Just assuming that DLA is going to be the same as the previous 5 things you've worked on with the advisors, I think is a real trap for people. They quite often, advisors get into a bit of a rhythm and it costs ultimately more money if that happens sometimes. So I think collaboration's the key, and I do think you've got to really, as I say, define the roles and be really clear about the roles with the client, with the business up front. By way of, I guess, an example, in the Hunter, we get a lot of manufacturing businesses, for example. Selling a manufacturing business or running a process for the sale of a manufacturing business is very different potentially for, say, an IP-laden business, a business with a lot of intellectual property in it. And getting that understood early and getting the advisors working collaboratively on that, I think is very important.
Yeah, sure. I guess, and when you talk about advisors, I know traditionally in this space, a lot of people think, have to go down the freeway to some of the major cities. But, like from even the Central Coast, Newcastle, Hunter Valley, there's a fair bit of capability in those markets now. And I mean, as you said, You've got a specialty division in that. So I think for business owners, it's fair to say they can, get pretty good advice right here in their backyard.
Yeah, we set the business up with that as a fundamental premise. I'm from a big city background. I grew up in the city and moved to the country. I've been here a long while now, but when I first came to town and started working in the Hunter Valley, everybody went down the freeway. In fact, the bigger deals, the transactions, even for private companies, were always done out of out of Phillip Street or the big end of town, as they say. That's changed. Our business has proven that we probably do 5 to 6 transactions in that mid-market space a year. They're all quite substantial. They would ordinarily, or historically I should say, have been done, out of Sydney. And there are a team of people, obviously PKF included, that know how to do M&A, that know how to do it properly. And quite often people in the Valley are selling out to their large competitor or their listed customer or competitor, and quite often we put a Hunter-based team together or a Central Coast-based team together to service that.
Yeah, sure.
And as I say, 15 years ago, that was an unusual situation. Yeah.
So when it comes to, our main focus was keep saying M&A, but there's a lot of divestments, I guess, that we probably just carry side by side with that.
Sure.
In our general conversation. There's a lot of businesses around this baby boomer cohort coming through and realising retirement that will come onto the market. There's a lot of info or reports around that. I guess first of all, what's your thoughts around that and how businesses can better prepare themselves or position themselves? And secondly, you would see a number of transactions that may not come off first or even second time, and it may take 3 times. So what's some advice you have around that?
Yeah, that's particularly if I can perhaps answer this way, prior to the GFC, the Hunter had been really discovered, I think, particularly by private equity. And so a lot of baby boomers, if that's the category of seller that we want to talk about, were quite opportunistic in that they'd recognised that, and again in the manufacturing business sector or even in tourism or consumer good or wine type sectors, there were lots of quick exits, and they happened very quickly. They were quite dynamic. They were often private equity funds investing alongside a family group. And there were probably 4 or 5 of those a calendar year that we were involved with. Post GFC, that just stopped. It's like a tap was turned off, as it was in the economy generally. Today, I would say that PE's back, private equity's back, looking again, and they're looking for intergenerational change, where they can partner with a son or a daughter who's taking the business forward, and they're looking to carry on. Again, often in parallel with the seller, and I think that's a relatively recent resurgence of private equity. The other thing I'd say about baby boomer exits is that the demographers are right. Obviously, the statistics don't lie that there are an inordinate number of older business owners who are looking for an exit, and it does take 3, 4, 5 times quite often, and it's often we've seen processes run, formal processes run, often by accounting firms or banks, merchant bankers, that fail dismally, and that doesn't mean that's a bad thing. What it does is it tests the market, it puts the sign up for sale, and it gets people interested in the business. There's nothing wrong with a business owner advertising in that sense. But there are lots of mistakes that are made, and the deals fail, I think, not because there's a willing or a lack of willingness on a selling side or a lack of anxiousness on a buy side, but because of the poor preparation. I think that's something obviously we should talk about, but in the context of your question, what I see often, in fact regularly, is sort of, and it comes back to that collaboration point I started with, is people just don't plan, for the exit. They don't plan for the transaction.
I think that's been in every one of these videos we've done with, no matter the advisor that's, or the specialist that's talking to business owners, a plan aspect has been just the consistent flavour.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, isn't it? I mean, in other parts of life, we train for everything. From, like, you even do wedding rehearsals, right? You've got to plan for everything. Yeah. And yet, after 40 years in business, perhaps with exposure to the BHP, selling a ball bearing or whatever it is to that enterprise, and probably surviving the closure of the BHP and reinventing yourself 2-3 times, you come to the sale. It's the business owner wanting to retire. You don't plan. No. You just walk up and go, I'm just going to hire this guy who's come in the front door and says he can sell my business, and that's that. Yeah. And it's kind of crazy, and we see it all the time.
Yeah, well, I guess that you lose perspective and become complacent fairly easily.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I also think you just get into a rhythm. You know, I mean, my example's deliberate. You know, for 30 years, you might have sold ball bearings to the BHP. You haven't just got up every morning and sold your ball bearings. And that's a very unreasonable comment to the ball bearing seller, but it's true, right? You did the same sort of thing over and over again. They close the BHP, you reinvent yourself, become something else using your plant and equipment. You then do that and you get that right after how many years? It might take you 2 or 3 business cycles to get that right. You come to sell your business and you expect to do it in 3 months.
And I think that's a fair point of when you said before about, or probably your opening point on how you work with business owners around having that team around you and that collaboration approach. That I know when we work, it's a concept of sale readiness, and that's not necessarily being open to the market, but it's putting yourself in that position so that any time somebody come along, the business is in a pretty good shape.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, a lot of people are maybe watching this or even that hear that M&A would think that even in your role, it's very one-off transactional, but I know that you'd work with businesses over and over and over again to make sure they're in that space or get them ready.
Yeah, we do. And you're right, it does tie back to that team-based approach to transactions. I think accountants are very good at the cyclical accounting. You know, that's the rhythm that they get into, to pick up on that theme again. And so businesses follow that rhythm, and that's a really good thing. There's lots of bits and pieces that can be done on the way through if you're looking 2-3 years hence for a sale as part of that rhythm. Collection of data, preparation of accounts, collation of contracts, you know, simple things that accountants are very good at being first to the party on, can be done in the context of sale readiness. And it mightn't even be for a sale, it's just good housekeeping. So we often come to a transaction with an accounting firm who's used to doing that sort of rhythmical data accumulation, and it's easier. You know, there's no doubt about it, because everything's in one place. For example, there's been a correlation between a contract and a line item in a balance sheet. There's been a risk identified in an insurance context or whatever it is. Now that all sounds pretty trite because it's good housekeeping, good business. But in a sale context or a sale readiness context, you know, it's vital. Predominantly because any problem with any of that stuff leads to price. Just relates to price negotiation, which is the central and most important element of any transaction negotiation.
So that's a good segue, probably one of my next points around, you know, we said you've been doing this for a long time, you've seen a lot of transactions, a lot of businesses, etc. What are some of the common mistakes you see from business owners that ultimately affect their, whether it be price or terms or whatever it may be in their transactions?
Not being ready is a mistake. Second guessing the market. It's tried again to say that your likely buyer will be a customer or a competitor, but you don't actually know that much about your customers or competitors in a transaction sense. You know a lot about them in a sales sense or in a marketing sense because you compete with them every day. But there's plenty of academic literature on knowing them in an M&A context that highlights the fact that you just don't know the critical elements of the buyer and their balance sheet and their leverage position and their appetite for risk. You can't unless you're in the boardroom, is the usual observation. And I think overestimating that or second guessing that's a big issue. A third example would be just not having your house in order. Assuming that a purchase order is a contract of the sort that's going to attract value is a good example. Particularly again in the Hunter's obviously exposed to mining. A purchase order with a big mining company is one thing, a long-term fixed contract with a mining company is another. Businesses, particularly in that SME segment, that small to medium market segment, assume that they've got 6 or 8 contracts because they've got 6 or 8 purchase orders, any one of which could be turned off tomorrow. So in terms of your question, in terms of value and price, those things are not as valuable as a long fixed term contract, for example.
Yeah, okay. And I guess the contra of that is then some of the mistakes you see are also some of the opportunities for the ones that are a bit more proactive.
Yeah, so in that example, we've had clients that have come to us early and that we've seen and done a pre-sale due diligence for, and we've said, fix this, this and this before you go anywhere near a merchant banker, for example, or go to the market. And that'll often be working in tandem with the accountant. It'll often be just on its own. We get a lot of people approach us first, which makes our practice a little bit unusual, to be honest. But because we've been doing it for quite some time and because it's our genuine specialty, people know to talk to us early. And so, yeah, we often, quite routinely actually, do pre-sale DD work and say to a fabricating client, for example, or a client with some intellectual property that's unregistered, have you thought about getting some advice on registering that intellectual property? Have you thought about getting some advice on perhaps documenting some of those contracts? Because they ultimately go to price and they ultimately go to value.
Yeah, it strengthens their position.
Strengthens their position.
So I guess I'll come back to that team aspect again. You mentioned merchant bankers, accountants, etc.
Yeah.
What are some of the other skill sets or professionals you'd see around the table and a business owner might need to be aware of with a transaction?
It depends on the business. We're doing a lot of work at the moment in tech and biotech, and it's amazing. It's sort of an interesting sector because the PhDs, it's sort of again a kind of a pithy observation, but the PhDs often drive those businesses. They often come from an R&D background with a university attached to them, say. And so the other members of the team in those businesses can often be the academic side, the PhD side. Another element of that type of example would be the use of patent attorneys and specialist intellectual property lawyers. So we do intellectual property work. We do a lot of intellectual property work because of the nature of the businesses we see here in the Valley. There's lots of IP, good IP, in traditional engineering and fabrication and manufacturing businesses that historically hadn't been registered, I would suggest, but is being registered, particularly prior to going, say, to China. But in that tech, biotech, academic end, if I can put it that way, we're seeing a lot more, PhDs, doctors, researchers at the table.
Yeah, right.
So you'll sit at a table with an accountant and a guy getting a banker or a private equity house or whatever, and there'll be a role for that specialty because that's ultimately what's being bought. They're buying the people, they're buying the know-how, and hopefully it's some registered intellectual property as well.
Yeah, okay. Which, to be honest, when you're talking this stuff, it doesn't come first to mind.
I use that as an example because it's unusual. I wouldn't say it happens every day, but we are seeing more of that. And as the Hunter and Newcastle becomes more of a sophisticated economy, if I can put it that way, there'll be more of it. The university's moved into town, there's lots more investment in startups and those sorts of things. And natural progression, 5, 10, 15 years from now will be more of that, I think.
Yeah, sure. So I guess talking about how you strengthen your position. Okay, you've mentioned around the contracts and income, that side of things. You've mentioned also maybe some of the intellectual property, etc. What are some of the other key leverage points, even from a high level, that a business owner should be focusing on if they took nothing else away to better position themselves for a transaction?
Again, I keep saying it depends on the business, but some of the things that we see in that small to medium market. So again, if we're acting for a very large, say, listed company, it's possibly different. But for a baby boomer exit company, which tends to be the tenet of your questioning, one of the best things to differentiate yourself, I think, is your people. Particularly if it's a private equity buyer or an investor, because they tend to back people. They'll once they get through what's on the balance sheet, what are your assets, let me see your intellectual property. Once they get through that due diligence, ultimately they're going to have to make a call on backing somebody. One of the big problems that we see on the coast or in the valley here is that there's always there's often a patriarch who wants to run, and private equity doesn't like that because they want to partner with a successful business person who knows the market and brings the insight. Knows the customers, has done it for years. So I think a big tip would be to go early. If that's the sort of route, the sort of co-investment or private equity or joint venture type route, is to go early, because the older you leave it, the harder it is.
Yeah, sure.
And I think Bernard Salt and all of the demographers would say those sorts of things. The baby boomers are hanging on is often something you see, in the Fairfax press, and it's the same in M&A. The longer you leave it, the harder it is for that type of transaction.
Yeah, okay. So a big one is around that people aspect, and then probably not just also the founders, if you like, but also who they're bringing through can be a big part.
Well, that's where I was going. So a big part of it, I think, is bringing through the next generation. There are plenty of very good operators in the 30s and 40s now, in some of these industries we're talking about, who need to be stepping in, and that means perhaps changing your equity structure, perhaps bringing an employee share plan into play, incentivising people to stick around and really hang on in preparation for a sale.
Yeah. No, that's good. So I think it's the last couple of videos we've done has been around people, and that just ties in very nicely to the people aspect of the value proposition. So.
Yeah, well, I think, as I say, we just see now more and more it's all about the value when they come to do the valuation, the value attributable to the people. Once you get through, as I say, all of those usual things.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay, big one. I know you're going to say it depends again, but this one on time. So I think it's, in my experience, everyone plans for the best case and often realises the worst case from a timeline point of view. Again, from experience and on average, what do you think? I mean, obviously, giving yourself more time is better, but what would your guidance be there?
Well, if you had have asked me in 2007, we were doing transactions in 3 months. Almost every transaction took 2 to 3 months. And they were very quick. In a pre-GFC environment, cash and debt wasn't an issue in the sort of speed sense.
Yeah, sure.
Now, if the transaction's leveraged, if the buyer's borrowing money to acquire, it slows the deal down. And in the sort of post-banking Royal Commission environment, that's a big handbrake. The flip side, though, is if it's a good business and it's well prepared, you can still do a 3 to 6 month transaction in the current market. The other thing I'd say, without trying to use the "it depends" phrase, is that really it's that point we talked about earlier that it might take 2, 3 or 4 goes to actually get a real transaction underway, and so it might seem like the actual transaction has taken 6 or 12 months, but the first 6 months might be dancing through a process or with market participants or various tidy up work or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
The actual transaction can still be done in 3 to 6 months is my experience, but it really turns on the industry, how keen it is. I mean, for example, we had an inbound transaction that hit us in about May, completed 30 June. It was done in about 6 weeks really, from go to woe, with an American document and an American buyer. So we acted for the American buyer. And that was quick. It was very fast and furious, lots of sleepless nights, but it can be done very quickly. So you're still seeing those sorts of transactions, particularly for inbound type buyers. But they were very prepared, the seller was very prepared, etc. Yeah,
sure. So I guess, again, that prepared comment comes up, and I think for anyone that's a key message here, is making sure that you can give yourself a lot of time even before you're thinking about a transaction to make sure that preparedness is there.
Yeah, I think so. People who might be watching this, would probably have heard a lot of the same comments from someone who does what I do, and that's because, like anything, like a sport or anything, there are certain themes that just repeat themselves over and over again. So identifying those themes and being aware of them, and then really thinking about them in the context of your own business in preparing for a sale, is part of the trick. You can save a lot of dough by getting yourself ready, working with your accountant who you see routinely, because of your tax return or because of your your audit or whatever it might be, to get ready. And that's, I said right at the start that 20 years ago, the roles were more defined and there were,
Clear cut.
Thank you. They were clear cut or clearer cut. These days, the accountants are first to the party. They do a lot more of this sort of stuff, which is a good thing, provided it delivers, for me, for what I specialise in, a really tidy package. But that's hard. That requires effort on the part of the business owner. It requires a clear trust and understanding between the people working with the business owner.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point too, that and I see this, and you would definitely see it, where because this is I guess one of experience, and you want experienced people on your side, you would see that you're not necessarily the day-to-day lawyer for some of these businesses that you get brought into on a transaction.
Yes.
as per our position wouldn't be either. And I think that's a very good step that the community is evolving around, and business owners are evolving, that they don't have to just stick to one person. They can get horses for courses and best advice possible.
Yeah, I mean, some of our best referrers are lawyers. Some of our best referrers are local lawyers who recognise, much in the same way that a GP might refer someone with a material cancer issue to a specialist, that when it comes to when their long-term business law client is coming to an exit, that it's time to see the specialist. And so we're lucky in that, particularly as this market has recognised the fact that they haven't got to go down the freeway, that we get a lot of referrals from lawyers. And we tend to work with the lawyers because they'll have the history. I mean, we're selling history as part of what we do. We're selling, in a liability sense, a claims period or a warranty period, and we need to understand the last 3, 5, 7 years of issues as well as looking forward. So there's a big element of that. So I think that's right. I think as the market locally and as you're right, on the coast as well, matures, that assists it's assisted our business, isn't it?
Yeah, look, it's less of they're a competitor. It's, well, hang on, they can actually complement me, my business and my clients. Yeah,
look, that's right. Don't be mistaken though. We obviously do general law work for businesses as well. Yeah. I'm not going to pretend that we don't. But the point I'm making is, we can have a look at independently 10 years of history in packaging a business up for sale and give a view on that. And we've certainly been engaged by, often referred by the lawyers, but engaged to do that sort of work when there's an
incumbent. And my message mainly out of that is for a business owner to really think about the skills they have around the table when they're looking for this. And there's more than one way to do it, that you don't have to necessarily break relationships. It's actually adding to your network of services and trusted professionals. Yeah. So maybe to flip it a little bit, we've spoken a lot about, I guess, divestments and sales, but about acquisitions in that M&A space, and how do you find that really fits with a business owner from a strategic play point of view?
Yeah, acquisitions probably need more work than divestments, but we don't typically have as big a role. So by that I mean, the idea of buying your competitor or subsuming a division of a listed company if you're the smaller minnow, for example, or variations on those two ends of the spectrum, requires a lot of financial and strategic thought before we become involved. One thing I would say though is that I've seen particularly local businesses that are growing really stuff up the confidentiality piece. And I don't just mean putting a non-disclosure agreement in place and getting that right. I mean, again, putting the team together on the acquisition and getting it right. So keeping it tight and keeping it confidential and involving, even if it's just to bring them in at the initial meeting and then not see them again until we've got something real down the track, which could be 3, 6, 12 months later. I think getting that team together early is vital. We tend to dip into acquisitions and then disappear, is what I guess I'm saying. We come in early, set up the legal framework in which the acquisition's going to occur, and we're very good at kind of setting that process in train. and then we don't really have a role until we're drafting.
Yeah, sure.
That's the reality. The due diligence piece in the middle, these days deals are done subject to due diligence. So there'll be a heads of agreement, a due diligence, and then a document. All the pre-heads of agreement work is largely financial and should be, because if it doesn't make economic and financial sense, then you're not going to be doing it, are you?
Yeah. But I think, again, we're talking about that, the evolution of a particular market, and say the Hunter or Central Coast and that sort of thing. They've rather than just get in and toil and do your hard work, M&A is a big part of business plans, growth, strategy these days, and it should be something that's looked at positively.
I think so. I think good businesses, big, and there are lots of them in the Valley. We're very lucky that there are lots of national businesses that are based here, some of which are just not known, that have got that way through very good strategic thinking. And acquisition takes many forms, is the other thing I'd say. It's not just going and buying the shares or the assets necessarily. Some of the strategic thinking is around key contracts, key people, key assets, and the acquisition or stockpiling of those assets. There are businesses in the Valley that have grown in mining by picking the cycle and stockpiling, and so the reason I've chosen, certain things to observe about acquisitions is because there are a range of things you can be doing. And what I agree with in your question is that it should form part of your strategic forward-looking planning, even if you're not going to acquire something, because it means you're thinking about what your competitors are doing, and you're thinking about the economy, and you're thinking about the growth of your business, all of which you should be doing anyway, right? So from a lawyer's perspective, there are certain themes that we see around key contracts and acquisition of plant, for example, that isn't M&A, isn't mergers and acquisitions per se, but the same skills apply.
Yeah, sure. And I won't even get started on whether a business owner needs a strategic plan or not, but for another day.
Sure.
I guess, Andrew, thanks, and we'll start to bring this together. I mean, we've taken a topic that is very, very wide, and as you say, have a bit of a laugh, but it depends, and it really does in this space. And it's, I think, just to summarise some of the points that you have said, Bart, but once again, that team is very important, having specialist skills who know what they're doing around the table, who can work together. One, saves time, saves costs, but gets the best outcome. Two, you mentioned a fair bit about making sure you're prepared, and that could take years. The transaction could take a lot less time if you are prepared, and a key point there, and getting people like Andrew involved early to give you some guidance around that too. Went through about making sure some of those key points on contracts and especially not just income but people.
Yeah.
Whether it's private equity, whether it's another investor, want to come along and they're really trying to grab the people to run this business. They're not going to be too attracted to an owner selling and running. Yeah. And somewhere in that contract terms, intellectual property, anything that's a bit you consider an asset to your business, and maybe you need to tighten up. That's in that preparedness stage, and using people like Andrew and his firm to get that right early on. And then we flipped it really to, I guess, whenever there's banking and funding and that sort of stuff involved, that could delay your transaction. You need to be prepared for that.
Sure.
And the final point we use is from a business strategy point of view then, in probably acquisitions, and good process to go through regardless of whether you're actually acquiring it. I think that's great advice to be aware and drive your business in the right direction. So I've just given a quick snapshot. I'm sure you've got more to it. Is there any other things you'd give advice on in that whole M&A space for a business owner that's watching this?
I think the most important thing is the planning point. The thing that I see every week when we get brought into transactions or brought into the strategic planning, or asked to present to a board on what we do or how we might be able to help a business, is that planning piece. Even just an initial discussion around what sorts of things could be important to a particular business. If M&A is on the horizon, even in the future, The earlier you can have that, the earlier you can think about that and start thinking about your team, the better. What typically happens in the Valley are opportunistic acquisitions where somebody comes in having identified through Google searches or whatever a particular target, and the seller gets hit at a weak moment with a term sheet or an exclusive document and signs it. We see that a lot because it is a very successful and light under the bushel economy, the Hunter. You know, it is that so-called engine room in many respects, particularly in the older industry sectors. So I would suggest that the earlier you bring in some thinking around what is my exit, how do I plan for a divestment, how do I plan for an acquisition, the better. That'd be my key piece of advice.
Yeah, no, I think it's that time aspect again and that planning. But and whilst we did say that, you know, it could take 2, 3, 4 times, for many people, as you said, it can happen first go, and you want to get it right because you know once it's done, it's done.
Yeah, or it comes out of the blue, Andrew, and that's often the problem, and then you're scrambling. And like in sport, you know, if the ball comes out and you're not ready for it, you've got problems.
Yeah.
So you've got to, like anything, train. I think. Yeah.
No, look, I reiterate that point, and I think the one thing I will stress, what we said at the start, is around that team and making sure you do have that specialist advice, because it is a specialist area. So, Andrew, thank you for joining me. Hopefully, you as the viewer can get something out of this and gives you another improvement for another episode of Down to Business. So, cheers.
Thanks.